Tonight we're going to be having Dr. Caleb Lack give us a speech, give us a talk on sharpening and leveling, how good communication leads you away from the truth. Ow! Yep. So,
you'd be surprised. About every third class. Yeah.
Okay.
Standing ovations. They know.
There you go. So, alright, so you're ready?
Alright.
So I'll let you take over, and after he's done, if anybody has any questions, he'll come. He does have a few books up here if anybody's interested in having one. If you're not a student. Otherwise, if you're a student, you may get some bonus points for buying this book. So if anybody has any questions about Skeptics, come talk to me or one of my officer team over here. You guys will hold your hands. Beth, Jason, thank you. So everybody enjoy the talk. All right, after you, sir.
Thanks, James. All right, so I will do my best to speak quite loudly and not eat too much of your food as it comes across in front of me, unless it's Chaz's, and then I will eat it all. So my name's Caleb, as you guys hopefully are able to suss out so far. I'm a psychologist and I'm a professor at the University of Central Oklahoma. I also write for a group called the Skeptic Inc. Network, which Damien, as well, here, writes as well. A blog called Background Probability. Mine's called The Great Plain Skeptic, and the address there is skepticinc.com/GPS if you're interested in psychology and skepticism, or just reading really cool things that I make my students write, then you should go there. You should check it out. So. Can you guys hear me? Am I speaking loud enough? Okay. Hello! Okay. Well, what I want to talk about today is a communication issue. How many of you guys ever communicated with someone else? Okay, we've got a couple of no's, but they're antisocial, so they don't count. We do this, especially Scott, he never talks. So we do this all the time, right? As a social animal, we communicate. We communicate with those around us that we know, that we don't know, that we want to know, that we don't want to know. We do a lot of communication. And it turns out some of us are really good at it, and some of us are really bad at it. Anyone ever had that sort of an experience? Some of you say, I am that sort of experience, right? Who in here likes to hear someone tell a bad story? Like a story badly, I should say. Some of you, for amusement purposes, you're like, yes, and then I can tell someone about it later, and we can laugh. How many of you guys know someone who doesn't tell stories well?
All the women should raise their hand.
She's all right. So how many of you know somebody who's a good storyteller? Like someone who, at a party, you get around them and it's entertaining, it's engaging. Yeah, it's a lot of fun, right? Well, it turns out that all of us want to tell good stories, even if you're bad at it. And all of us actually also want to hear good stories. And so the people who are communicating and the people who are listening have very complementary goals, right? They want to tell a good story, you want to hear a good story. This should match up really easily, right? Like this makes sense, this sounds good. And what we're really talking about here is we're talking about what we call justified communication. And so communication, ideally, is justified. Do we have any Raylan fans in here? Any fans? Okay. Maybe. And also, he just looks like a badass, right? And I usually wear a hat, but I didn't today because it was hot, but not really. Communication should be justified. When I'm talking about justified, what I'm talking about specifically is that when I'm communicating with you, or with you, or with you, or with all of you, my message should be worthy of your attention. Right? So in other words, I should be telling you something that holds your attention, something that makes you go, oh, okay, great. Like this is interesting, this is exciting, this is funny, whatever sort of communication I'm trying to do. At the same time, on the opposite side, your message that you're telling should be worthy of my attention. Right? So again, the listener and the teller have complementary goals. So it should be easy to do this, right? It turns out it's not. And those of you who are very bad at storytelling know this, right? My wife, who's not here tonight, my wife, not a good storyteller. Not a good story. She's not. I mean, she tells you this. She's open about this. She's also not a good joke teller. You guys, those things often go hand in hand, right? Where I start to tell a joke and I was like, wait, no. Oh, was that it? Okay, hold on, let me start over. No, you've ruined it already. Right? We will stop the joke now. So, in other words, one of the big things that people do who are not good storytellers, who don't have justifiable communication, what they do is they weigh down their message with needless detail. One of my friends does this, one of my best friends, George. He's not good at this. And what George does is, I say something like, hey George, what'd you have for lunch today? George gives me an answer not unlike this. Well, it was about 11:30 or so. And I was in the office, and I got hungry. No shit, it's lunchtime. I already know the shit, right? And so I thought to myself, what should I be eating? I'm trying to eat healthy, and he just goes on with all these details, right? And then he gives you information like, and so I got in my car, and I drove to this, down this street, and you were bored out of your mind. I literally needed 3 words, right? I ate Sonic. Right? That's all. That answers my question. But George gives me a 5 to 10 minute speech. Right? And he's, again, one of these people who's aware of this. And so people a lot of times will clog down their communication with needless detail. So I have a simple answer that I need from you. I get a 10-minute story. And so otherwise, that communication is not justified. Right? That message, I'm wandering all over the place mentally. Like, all right, George, okay. What else do I have to do today? What else did I do? And then at the end of the 10 minutes when he finally says, I ate Sonic. I'm like, oh, right, there you go. There it is. And so what we really are trying to do when we communicate is we're trying to inform and we're trying to entertain. And you can have people who are trying to inform only, people who are trying to entertain only, or people who are trying to do both. If you're being informed, learning something new, or if you're being entertained, then you consider the message worthy. This is a justified message. And it turns out we're not all that good at it. Some of us are very, very good at it. And those of us who are good at it tend to do a couple of things. Right? So, let me grab this drink. What I'm doing is I'm drinking through a straw. And the straw, what happens is water comes up. See, that's bad communication. Right? I just say I needed a drink. That's all you need to say. Now, to make communication and stories that we tell, and when I say stories, I'm not just talking about, how Batman's parents were murdered, or, what happened at this funny occasion. I'm talking about stories meaning any communication between me and another individual. To make stories worthy, justified, a lot of times what we do is we actually take the original content of the story, the original information, and we change it. We change the form and we change the content of the story to make it more worthy, to make it more justified, in other words. If we don't do that, we don't tend to be a good storyteller. Because I bog it down with details. So if I said something like, okay, I was coming down here to the Paseo District tonight, I got it confused with the Plaza District, and so I'm down there going, where the hell's Picasso's? Oh, it says Plaza, not Picasso, or not Paseo. So then I had to find out what Paseo was. You don't need to know the make and model of my car, how fast I was driving, what other cars were on the street. I gave you the information you need to know. But I changed the content of the story. I changed the form of the story a little bit. And what we tend to do is we tend to do 2 things very, very often. One of these is called sharpening, and one of these is called leveling. When I sharpen a story, right, when I sharpen information, after I hear it, what we do is we emphasize what we consider to be important. When I level information, I de-emphasize what we consider unimportant. So good communicators and good storytellers do this naturally. So you tell me a joke, I'll tell that joke to someone else in pretty much the same form. You tell me a story, on the other hand, what I'll do is I'll tell, here's what I felt was most important about that story. I'll drop out the stuff I didn't need to say, or the stuff that doesn't really communicate my message too much. These terms come, do we have any audio files in here? Anybody who likes working with audio? So you're familiar with these terms working with audio, right? Sharpening and leveling, where what you do is you bring up the audio that you want people to hear, and you take down the audio you don't want people to hear. So we sharpen, emphasize certain parts, and we level, de-emphasize other parts. And what this does is this actually makes our stories better. Right? It makes our stories better. And think about this next time you're having a conversation with someone and they're trying to tell you information. Because what you'll find inevitably is that those people who are good communicators do a lot of sharpening. Those people who are not, don't. And it's really the leveling that's the most important part for good communication. Because how many of you guys tell a story and feel like you have to tell all the details of the story? Right? Here's all of the things that happened. I don't need to know all the things. I just need to know what's important. Right? How was your trip this weekend? Well, we left at 5:38 a.m. We drove on I-35 north for approximately 46 miles before turning. No, right? How was your trip this weekend? It was great. You know, we went up to Stillwater. We hung out at Lake Park Blackwell. It was a good time. Excellent. Good. Sharpen and level. Right? Now, the problem with sharpening and leveling, though, is what this does is, although this makes stories more entertaining in general, it tends to make them less accurate. And this is where people start to go, ha ha ha, yeah, that's why I have to tell all of the things. Well, not usually, right? Hopefully not, but yes, you tend to, right? And then people tend to glaze over with their eyes, and they go, oh God, here it comes again. Really, we have to hear all of this again. I already know the make and model of your car, you told me that earlier. But you tell all the details. When you sharpen and you level, it's a better story. You're being a better communicator, but you're leaving out important details. And sometimes this doesn't make a difference. Right? Sometimes it doesn't make a difference. You're telling a funny story about something that happened to you and your friends last week. That probably isn't going to be of huge importance on the world stage. Right? It's not going to have a crazy impact on the world that you left out the fact that you weren't actually there. And you just heard this story from somebody else. So that's not going to have that big of an impact. But what we see is it's not just when I tell a story to a friend or someone that I know that we do this kind of sharpening and leveling. Instead, it happens all the time. So in the early 1920s, the world was caught up in a rush of excitement about Egypt. Right? There were a huge number of excavations going on in Egypt. Large numbers of tombs were being excavated. And the most famous of these turns out to be the tomb of the Pharaoh Tutankhamun. King Tut for short. You may know him from rhymes such as King Tut, Smell My Butt. Or perhaps a history class. Now the guy who opened up King Tut's tomb became extraordinarily famous for this. But what became even more famous was the curse of King Tut's tomb. And what was reported on at the time that it happened, and then actually for years and years afterward, even today, is that there was a curse on this tomb. And this caused large numbers of people who were associated with opening King Tut's tomb to die. Some accounts put it at as many as 20 or 25 people over the next decade that were involved in the actual excavation. And this included things like the canary that they used to check for gases actually was attacked by a cobra inside the home the day it was opened. The person who sponsored it, someone's personal assistant that was there. I mean, it just got on and on and on and on and on. And people tell this story, and they say, "Oh, because it was cursed, right? There was a curse on the front that whosoever shall destroy or disturb this tomb shall be cursed for all eternity with death." I don't know how to say that in hieroglyphics. I could draw it perhaps, but we don't have a whiteboard, so thankfully I won't have to. How many of you guys have heard that? A story about the curse of King Tut? Anybody? Okay. And you thought, wow, that's kind of crazy, right? But because you're all skeptics, you're like, man, I don't know. Let me go look up on Rational Wiki or whatever the true story. But most people don't. Most people just go, oh, that's crazy. Like, people die because they opened up this Pharaoh's tomb. But that's a very sharpened and leveled story. If you step back and look at all the stories, what you find is that you very quickly see there's not a higher rate of death for the people that opened that tomb versus opening other tombs, or the people that opened that tomb versus other non-Egyptians who were in country at the time, or even greater than the rate of natural death for people of that particular age at that time. And you even learn, for example, that there wasn't a curse. There was literally nothing written on there cursing anybody. And so you start seeing more details. But all of a sudden, that starts making for a less enjoyable story. Right? So if I go up to Chaz and I'm like, hey Chaz, I heard this story the other day about how King Tut's tomb was not cursed and nothing happened to everybody who opened it. Blasphemy. That sucks, right? That's a terrible story. Like, no one wants to hear that story, except a bunch of skeptics. And they're like, I knew it! I knew there was no curse, right? Score one for a reason. But let's face it, the other 99% of the population who are not mutants like we are, they don't like that story. Right? It's boring. That's an example of a story that's been sharpened and leveled at this point for about 80 years. And I could go on, and it turns out that a lot of the stories, for those of you who ever had a general psychology course, a lot of those stories, extraordinarily sharpened and leveled. The Stanford prison study experiment, when you talk about Philip Zimbardo and the guards and the prisoners, John Watson's study with little Albert conditioning fears, all of these things and how we tell them in modern textbooks bear not a whole hell of a lot of resemblance to the actual truth of the journal articles or the experiments, because they've been sharpened and leveled so much. Now, why do we do that is the question. Okay? Who has a guess?
Narrative at the expense.
Good. Right? So we lose detail, we get inaccuracies, but what we do is we emphasize what we want people to know. So for example, for John Watson's classical conditioning of little Albert's phobias, what we want people to understand in a general sense is how people could be conditioned behaviorally to have a phobia or a fear of something. You don't need to know all the specific details to understand the gist of it. Or in the experiments of Zimbardo with the guards and the prisoners in the Stanford prison study, we want people to just think about how the power of the situation changes your behavior. You don't need to know all the other details necessarily. And so we do this. We all do this. But this occurs especially often if you have no first-hand information about the subject. So in other words, Scott tells me a story, and I don't know the people involved in Scott's story. And then I try and relay that story over here to somebody else. And all of a sudden, I'm much more likely to sharpen and level that information and then distort that communication because I don't have any first-hand experience with that particular topic. Because when we have second-hand stories, what we do is we massively sharpen the people involved in the story. And we massively sharpen their actions. And then we massively shrink and level the situation. And this is seen on our newscast every night. You look at the newspapers, you look at Fox and CNN and NBC. And what you see is you see people talking about people and what they did. You don't see people talking about situations. And there's a reason for this. And that reason is that actions and actors go together. Right? People and what they do go together. Because we describe these in the same terms. So she's pouring water right now. The water was poured, right? We don't say the restaurant was poured, right? Or the group was pouring. I mean, some of you might be because it's hot in here. Maybe it's just me. But we tend to talk about people and what they do in the same terms. And then what this does is this makes it very easy for us to emphasize the person's actions. One example of this recently, I say recently, in the last 10 years, was the prison scandal in Abu Ghraib. So who knows what I'm talking about with that? All right. So what we had a number of Iraqi prisoners who were massively degraded, who were treated inhumanely, who were basically dehumanized by our military service people in the prison setting. And when this story broke, what happened was you had the military, the brass, immediately saying these are just bad people. It's not the situation, these are bad people. You had all sorts of news press jumping on the individuals that were involved, the female in particular that was involved in that. She got all sorts of negative publicity in press. People hated her. How could you do this? How could you do this? And this is exactly what they did. They sharpened the person and what they did, and they de-emphasized the situation. They didn't talk about, well, here's why they did this. So we actually know from years and decades of psychological research that when you put people in this kind of a situation, they're going to respond in a particularly negative way. But you didn't hear people talking about it. You just heard them talking about, here's these people, here's the terrible things that they did. And they completely ignored the situational factors that contributed to those terrible things. We do this all the time. This happens every day in all the communication that you hear. And so what we see then is we see secondhand stories are much cleaner. Right? They're much cleaner because they've been leveled. They're much simpler. So you're getting your news. That news has been sharpened and leveled already into a 35-second news bite. Right? You don't get the full story. You don't have all the information available. So in other words, this communication is very justified. That's why people watch this stuff, right? You're drawn to it. You're watching it. This is great. This is great. But it's extraordinarily distorted. Just like, for example, when you hear stories about ghosts, right? Or Bigfoot. Or UFO sightings. And you'll have people that sharpen and level those things to death. Until what it does is it eventually becomes this very simple thing. Yeah, my uncle's stepfather, until the day he died, swore that he saw Bigfoot in southwestern Arkansas. And that's true, actually. My uncle Kenneth's stepfather swore until the day he died that he saw Bigfoot. And he would tell a story about how he was very scared by this large creature that came at him and had this really crazy stench that made this weird sounds. And he would tell the story, and there's undoubtedly much more that he didn't tell, or that he's forgotten, that made that story better, simpler, cleaner, but very distorted. So when you're listening to people communicate, there are certain kinds of distortions that you need to be on the lookout for. So here comes here's how you apply this in your world part of the talk, right? It's not just all loosey-goosey information. So one of the biggest things that you see people do is people increase the immediacy of an event. So in other words, you say something like, well, this guy I know said that he saw, when in reality what you're having is well, that guy said that he knew a guy who saw this sort of thing. But if I say that, you're like, oh, yeah, whatever. Who are you? I don't know this person that knows this person. But you say, oh, yeah, well, I know a guy, my best friend. He da-da-da. And that increases the immediacy of this communication. It makes me want to believe you more. It's even better if you say it happened to me. I was driving down the road, and I saw da-da-da-da. As opposed to, yeah, I heard somebody talking about this. I don't know who they were or anything. They said they were driving down the road. Oh, I've already tuned out. And we do this as skeptics and as rationalists just about as often as other folks do. You also see that people will very often overextend information, or they will leave certain qualifiers out of a story. And one of my favorite examples of this is diet ads. Right? Here's some diet pills, or here's a new ab roller 4300, or ass flexor 14, or whatever it is that they put out there on a very regular basis. So what they do is they tend to exaggerate the risks or exaggerate the potential benefits of some sort of behavior or product, right? So you look at, this sort of you look at this, this picture and you see like, holy crap, like look, it looks like me, and then it looks like someone who's definitely not me. In 2 weeks? That's fantastic. Like, that's amazing. I gotta get me some of that, right? And then you'll go and you'll, spend, I don't even know what the ad is for. Oh, it's a new weight loss miracle herb. It's called amphetamine. But it's new. It's a new miracle herb. So you leave out the fact that, oh, well, the person got from this to this because they were not eating anything and they had just had massive liposuction and resculpting surgery. But yeah, in 2 weeks they went from that to that. And they also happen to be taking this magical herb. Yeah. So hey, it's obviously the best thing. Let's get all of those, right? Let's take all of these pills. But they leave all these things out. They exaggerate these things. We also see, and this is where I have a particularly large beef with our news industry, is that there's an emphasis on entertaining over actually informing. So if you just go and look at newscasts from 30 years ago, and you compare those newscasts to today, there's a massive, massive difference. Right? Massive difference. They're very factual based. There's the information on how it happened to the best of our degree to relay to you. It's not, here it is from my particular ideological spin. Right? Here's not, I'm going to leave a lot of this information out. It's much more fact-based rather than entertainment-based, which is what we see with almost all of our news figures. Even the ones we tend to not hate, right? Even the ones that are on my ideological side, they still do this, right? They're just there to entertain. They're not there to really inform you. And it's even worse once you get a little earlier in the day, where you start seeing people like Mehmet Oz and Dr. Phil, he's pointing at you because you did something that you need to buy a book about, or perhaps something else that I'm now hawking. Right? Where you have these people who are entertaining, they're not informing. I mean, Mehmet Oz, brilliant cardiac surgeon, complete jackass on everything else. He just spouts nonsense for the vast majority of his talks every day that's watched by millions of people. But people believe it because it's entertaining, right? I've got this giant diorama that now we can walk around inside of the heart, and I'll show you what the acai berry does to this part of your heart. Which it doesn't really do, obviously. And I don't know if I pronounced that right. Does anyone know that? Is it close enough? Okay. I can spell it. It's got an A-C-A-I. I think there's a little thing on the C.
You can't say it right without sounding douchey.
Without sounding douchey. Thank you. Then it's the acai berry. So this is what we do. Right? This is what all these channels are all about. They're all about entertaining. They're not about actually informing people. And they do that by sharpening and leveling the situation. We also see a lot of people who distort information, and they claim to be doing that for the greater good, or for the greater truth. And in my opinion, there's no better example of this in American history for as long as what we've seen in terms of the war on drugs, where we start seeing very, very early, actually around the start of the 1900s, a demonization of people who are using various substances, originally because they're not white. So, for example, opium was originally demonized because it was primarily the Chinese who were using it. Marijuana was originally demonized because it was primarily Hispanics and blacks that were using it. And then we see this sort of distortion of information about the both dangers and benefits of this kind of thing. And we see this still today, for example, with the fight across the country to legalize marijuana or not. And obviously there's enormous numbers of other issues here. You see this for gay marriage equality, for example, where people will, oh no, it's marriage is a man and a woman. It's like, oh right, for like the last 120 years in this country, right? In certain parts of the country. But no, that's tradition. Actually, it's not in any way, right? You're sharpening and you're leveling the actual complicated history of what we call marriage and love here in this world. So we see people that do this, and they do it by sharpening and leveling information all the time. So when you're being communicated to, it's really important for you to try and detect distortions, because that will tell you that I am not getting truth. Right? I'm not getting the actual information that should be out there. And you can detect them by considering the source. Right? Who's telling me this information? What's their potential agenda? Right? Do they have a reason why they would want to distort this information? You also want to trust facts when at all possible and distrust predictions. And a good example of this is in the late 80s with what we saw about AIDS, where AIDS was this new, very scary thing that a lot of the news media picked up and covered. And you had national newspapers printing headlines like, 1 in 10 American babies expected to be born with AIDS by 1990. Y'all remember when that happened? Turns out it's not here, right? And so you have a lot of predictions where you can't really trust them. Trust facts. You also want to be really on the lookout for sharpening and leveling. So ask questions, right? Follow up with questions. Good story. What about this? What about that? Is there anything about the situation that you left out? What was going on around you at that time? Rather than just saying, oh, okay, cool story, bro. And then you want to be very wary of testimonials. Anytime someone is telling me something that's anecdotally based, rather than evidence-based, I get very twitchy. Well, I did this and it worked for me. Congratulations. Right? You wish we twitch? Right? Yeah, don't, no. I start saying data, right? Long term, give me groups of data, right? Give me meta-analyses that I can actually look at here, rather than just your story about this work. So, that's what I've got. I'm more than happy to answer questions or chat about whatever you guys want to know about that I might be able to tell you. And there you go.
On behalf of Oklahoma Skeptics, I would like to thank you for coming and speaking to us. And because I know we put them in a lot of stress, I would love to thank the staff of Picasso's for taking care of us tonight.